Welcome back to Engage in Truth. This is Steve Ford, your co-host, along with Pastor John Bornschein, Senior Pastor at Calvary Fellowship Fountain Valley, located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Thank you so much for joining us again today. Well, for the last few episodes, we put our discussion of the book of Daniel on hold to speak, one, with Andrea Crum. We had a couple of episodes with her. She wrote a book titled Christ Over Culture. We discussed exactly what a biblical worldview looks like and how we can disciple the members of our family that God has put within our sphere of influence. Last episode, Pastor John provided us with an excellent synopsis of the Christian worldview, and today we will return to our discussion of the book of Daniel with Daniel chapter 5, where we find out exactly where the idiom, the writing on the wall, came from. Remember that you can find prior episodes of this series, along with prior episodes of this broadcast, archived on the church's website at calvaryfountain.com. That's calvaryfountain.com. And here's Pastor John to get us started.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ford. Well, Happy New Year, my friend.
Yeah, you as well.
It's incredible. What a study we have had through the book of Daniel thus far. And of course, we had to deviate so many times to address things that were going on in the world, even covering a number of stories related to the nation of Israel. And so we are so grateful to each of you, our listener, who have made the time to continue to stay with us. Maybe you've been eager to go, hey, how much more in Daniel? It's been months and months now in Daniel. But hopefully you've appreciated the fact that we try to stay relevant by covering what's going on so that we can pray rightly and be able to be mindful of what's going on as we draw closer to the return of Jesus Christ our Lord. He's closer to his return than ever before. So we need to always be mindful of how certain events may be playing into biblical prophecy, especially when you have 18 prophetic books in the Bible. So we keep going back to those other texts a number of times, and we keep our eyes peeled for the fact that Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38 and 39 are on the horizon. Yeah. So as we study Daniel, be ready for that. We may take you off on some other prophetic texts as well. And Daniel is certainly one of those key books. It is to the Old Testament what the book of Revelation is to the New Testament. Right. And so if you are just tuning in for the first time, we would hope that you make Engage in Truth part of your regular weekly schedule, that you're going to listen in each and every week to hear this program, because I think you'll be excited, as we are, to study God's holy word. We have been in the book of Daniel. Let me just recap for you just a moment. We're going to really dive now into chapter 5. But the whole book of Daniel was written around 530 to 536 BC. And this book has been preserved through the generations, and 8 scrolls of Daniel were discovered in 3 of the 11 caves at Qumran. In fact, the oldest of these is dated to around 190 BC. That's the late 2nd century BC, though some would argue that it might even be around 125 BC. So these texts, I just find, Dr. Ford, it's so amazing. They still exist today, meaning they're over 2,000 years old. In addition to that, there's over 10,000 fragments from Babylon to support the historical records that are found in Daniel. So the text that we're reading today was written in Aramaic, and we see that from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, all the way through Daniel 7, verse 28. So the scrolls were found in both Aramaic and Hebrew, which were used to confirm the transcription accuracy. So God has given us the vault, and out of the vault, we've been able to hold all of the modern texts accountable to these ancient texts to know that we're still reading it rightly. So when you read Daniel chapter 5, you're actually reading an eyewitness account of the fall of the Babylonian Empire by the one who was prime minister of that very empire. So even though he was a prime minister in a pagan culture, in a pagan society, he never compromised his faith in the true God. That's what we gravitate to as we read this. How did he remain so steadfast, firm in his faith? And so every time he appears on the scene, we find him somehow unrelated to everybody else's issues, burdens, stresses. He always makes a grand entrance alone, and never with the magicians, never with the soothsayers or the Chaldeans who come in to give their human wisdom. And so he just seems to be just set apart. He's God's man. And the record he has given us is wonderfully true. It's been verified. It's been authenticated. So here in Daniel 5, we're going to read of the end of what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the head of gold that was represented by Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. And so now, according to Daniel chapter 2, we're moving into the Medo-Persian Empire that was represented by the chest and arms of silver. So at the beginning of this chapter, what we read is of the gross depiction of immorality, self-indulgence, and pride that had become Neo-Babylon. And in this debauchery, God will intervene with a powerful display of divine graffiti that leads to instant judgment, as we see in Psalm chapter 9, verse 17. So as we read it, we've got to try to be mindful of the fact that we need to understand both the history of it and its application today. And that's one thing we can do through Daniel, is know that we can apply this text even now. And I want you to understand, as we look at this, you've got to take into account here the fact that as we see the rise and fall, ebbs and flows of Babylon, it wasn't that they weren't given an opportunity. Over and over again, they had seen the handiwork of God. They had seen the miraculous deliverance of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, taken right out of the fiery furnace. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were delivered miraculously. We see Nebuchadnezzar as he was sent out into the wilderness, if you will, for 7 years, having lost his mind and coming back in repentance unto God. We see that at the end of chapter 4. They had plenty of signs, and yet the hardened hearts of the people would constantly turn away from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his representatives that were already in their midst. Because we have to remember that on the scene here is not just Daniel, who's in the administrative wing, but we have Ezekiel, who's also down with the people, right? So there are many prophets here. Not only had they already heard from Isaiah and Jeremiah, but now they can also hear from Ezekiel, who's on the scene. And so there are plenty of, dare we call them heralds? The ones who were blowing the trumpet to say, listen to the word of God that is going out in your midst. So let's look at chapter 5, verse 1 here. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. So last time when we were at chapter 4, we see the end of the spiritual biography of Nebuchadnezzar. So what happened afterward? Well, Nebuchadnezzar died around 562, 561 BC, which still fascinates me, that we can actually hone it down to that close, that we're within a year's time frame of 562 to 561 BC. He was succeeded by his own son. Now, Amel-Marduk, known as Evil Merodach, of 2 Kings chapter 25 and Jeremiah 52. He reigned for only 2 years and was assassinated in 560 BC by his brother-in-law. And now he's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39 under a different name. And after 4 years, he died. He was succeeded by his son. Now, the son is promptly assassinated after a 9-month reign. So he marries the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who assumed power and shared it with his oldest son, a co-regent named Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar, 549 BC, and so Nabonidus, who ruled the empire from Tema, which is in the middle of Arabia, and it was Belshazzar who ruled over the city of Babylon, since he was a blood relative, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar calls Nebuchadnezzar his father, but this is a generic use of the word father, meaning ancestor. So Belshazzar becomes king over the whole empire after Nabonidus is defeated. And that's about 50 miles or so south of Babylon where that defeat took place, and is taken captive by Cyrus, who led the Medes and the Persians. And right now you're probably going, I don't have any idea what you just said. Basically, what I'm just trying to do is summarize here for you a very swift sequence of events that sounds a lot like Roman history, where somebody comes to power, they're assassinated, they're overthrown by a family member, a distant relative then comes to power who still calls them a father, but they're not really a father-son relationship, but rather an ancestry type relationship. And so what we find here is that Nabonidus had been exiled to a place that was just outside, outside of Babylon until about the time of his death. He never will see Babylon again. And so what that means is by the beginning of chapter 5 here of Daniel, 539 BC, Daniel has been in Babylon for 66 years. He's now 80 years old, and he served under 5 of 7 different administrations he will serve under during his time in Babylon, but not necessarily in the way he did for Nebuchadnezzar. So as you're going to see here for a moment, Daniel was around 14 years old in chapter 1, and he's now around 80 years of age in chapter 5. So he has seen a lot, especially in these 5 administrations. So the chapter begins after Nabonidus has been defeated and exiled. The Medes and the Persians are everywhere. They're taking the kingdom of Neo-Babylon. They've been attacking every outpost and territory, and the empire is shrinking with every loss. And where do we find Belshazzar? He's having a party before 1,000 of his lords. So let's pick up here, verse 2.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, Daniel, chapter 5, verse 2. This is amazing. So he says, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the kings and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them.
Okay, so let's start off here. So here's a sit rep. We've got now a sequence of events in which kings have come and gone, and now you have the enemies of Babylon are rising up in power. They are a formidable force that is coming down upon them, and now they're having a party. And the Persian monarchs, for example, as we understand from archaeological discovery, were known to dine daily. So these kind of kingly feasts were not uncommon, even in a time of war. But listen to this. From the Persian monarch history, we find out that in one particular instance, they were known to dine with 15,000 guests at a single meal. Wow. Now, that's a lot of mouths to feed. Over Christmas, we had like 20 people in our house, and I was struggling to feed them all. I can imagine 15,000 people. Alexander the Great had 10,000 people come to his wedding reception. We see a number of these. I mean, banquets that even in 879 BC from another king, he had thrown a party for 69,754 guests. So you talk about the dinners of the Persians and many other groups. They were quite the festivals, if you will. In one particular passage that was recorded in ancient Persian history, they had 1,000 animals that were slaughtered daily for the king. 1,000 animals every day. These comprised of, horses, camels, oxen, donkeys, deer, and various smaller animals. In fact, many birds would be consumed, including ostriches, geese, and chickens. Okay, so now that's quite the buffet of meat that most likely I wouldn't eat. I mean, maybe some animals in there. I have never eaten a horse, never planned to. Just doesn't sound right. Maybe ostriches or even geese. That doesn't really sound good to me either. But they would do this to display their power, as if to show that they were unshaken by anything. Nothing's going to interrupt this party. Even when enemies are mounting against them, they are not going to show any weakness, like they're shaking in their boots. Absolutely not. So what we looked at last time, we went through the images, if you will, of Babylon. And they had a false sense of security. Even today, if you go through the archaeology of it, they would have these magnificent walls and structures and the opulence of the city. They thought that they would never fall. And to the contrary, what we find at time and time again, anything where man thinks it's impervious to defeat is often brought low. Even boats, there are people say that even God can't sink this, will sink on their maiden voyage. Right. So we find out time and time again, like Babylon, ancient Babylon, and even the time of the tower that was erected by Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, it too fell to destruction. So these things are quite symbolic that when we think ourselves impervious, God has other plans. Yeah,
well, like you said, Nabonidus had been taken not far away, and here's this extreme display of denial going on. There they are feasting. Maybe it's to display confidence in their false gods. And in so doing, Belshazzar decides that he wants to make another statement. So he decides it was time to openly insult the God of the captives in Babylon. Never a good idea.
Right.
As if to make an example. So he takes all the items from the temple God had in Jerusalem, 605 BC, 587, 586 BC. These items were gathered together. He gets them out and uses them in an act of blasphemy. It wasn't done out of ignorance. This was intentional. The king knows the stories of the God of the Israelites. But in his foolish folly, he challenged Yahweh. And like Herod of Acts 12, there will be serious consequences. In verse 3 to 4, we read, Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Just makes me want to flinch, just waiting for something to happen. So many scholars and theologians take this description to mean that this was really a drunken orgy taking place, desecrating the instruments of the worship of the one true holy God. It was a complete perversion, desecration, and mockery of God.
Let's find out what happens next. Verse 5, Daniel chapter 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Okay, pause there for a moment. So here we have the cup of God's wrath being poured out. It's full. The time of judgment has come. So in the midst of this godless behavior, God brings it all to an end. This lampstand area would have been most likely above the head of the king. So an archaeologist, interestingly, he was excavating Babylon, and he says that they found a room that measured approximately 55 feet wide and 169 feet long. There was still plaster on some of the walls. They also found the space where the king would have sat. So it's possible that this discovery was the very place where God had declared judgment over Babylon. Verse 6, then the king's countenance changed. Oh, I bet it did. And his thoughts troubled him so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. So his face was probably, I suspect here, previously red from all the consumption of wine and all the revelry that followed all of this. Now, suddenly the color just falls out of his face. He is now ghostly white. All of his strength leaves him. He couldn't even stand up. And this is the same imagery that's used in Nahum chapter 2, verse 10 of Nineveh, and also found in Haggai chapter 2, verse 7, where we read that God will shake the nations. So he certainly shook Babylon, and he's going to do it again over the whole system of Babylon that was infesting the entirety of the world. And we read that in Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 to 24.
Yeah, in Revelation 6, we read, and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every man hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So go back and be humbled as you read Zephaniah 1 to 18. So when Christ returns, everything will be shaken, including every island and every mountain. We see that in Revelation 16. In Daniel 7, the king cried out loud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the entire kingdom.
So here's the same group being called on again who failed Nebuchadnezzar. We see repetition here. They fail and in Daniel chapter 2 and in Daniel chapter 4. And so we notice here once again that Daniel is not with them. He does not walk with this crowd, and it matters ultimately who you associate with. And you know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about evangelism here. I'm talking about who we hang out with, who we associate with, who we mingle with. Daniel doesn't do that with this crowd. So this king says, third ruler because Nabonidus is still the ruler technically, though he's now in exile. So Belshazzar, who was number 2, Belshazzar, we could say it like that. So he's the number 2. So Nabonidus is still alive. He's technically number 1. Belshazzar, number 2. So this decree is to make this person, whoever is able to interpret this writing, that they will have a monarchy role, most likely as prime minister. And that was the role that Daniel previously held under Nebuchadnezzar. So something has changed with all these administrative changes. So let's look here at verse 8. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. So these men are once again useless to the king. All right, we see this repetition. They couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. They can't even read the words that are in their own language. So what is before them is written in Aramaic, but they could not read it. Why? We don't know. Some people say because God has his own way of curving letters. I don't know that's true. But maybe they were just so blind in their sin, they couldn't read the writing on the wall. Right? That's, I think, what we take away from that, Dr. Ford, is that, sometimes we can see it in our own language. We can read the words. We could even partly understand the words. But if our hearts are so filled with sin, we're not going to heed it. We're not even going to understand it.
Yeah.
And we see that in John chapter 6, when they hear the words of Jesus, but the words were too hard for them. Not because what he was saying couldn't be understood, but because their hearts were so full, they couldn't commit to what he was calling them to commit to.
Yeah.
And so here, verse 9, it says, Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. So Pharaoh had a false sense of security when his magicians were able to turn their staves into snakes, turn water to blood, or call forth frogs in response to the judgments of God. But he was no match for God. Here, this king doesn't even get a false sense of security. No one was able to translate the words for him, and he was defeated in his heart. In verse 10 of Daniel 5, it says, The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. So scholars seem to agree on this, that the woman speaking here was Belshazzar's mother. So not his wife. She is trying to comfort her son, and her memory serves her well. So listen to what she says here in verses 11 to 12. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So we'll pause there. We'll come back to this and finish Daniel chapter 5 next week. But you can see now the stage is being set just like it was with Nebuchadnezzar, where Daniel can be presented as an instrument of God to steer the course of this kingdom, to give a word, and ultimately to be God's man on the scene to speak on behalf of God, and yes, to protect the people of Israel that are still in Babylon. And you need to keep that imagery in your mind, because we as Christians are still in the realm of Babylon. God is speaking to us through his word. He's instructing us how to conduct ourselves in the age of Babylon that consumes the earth with its paganism, and how we are to prepare ourselves, not walking in the crowds of the godless outside of evangelism as we give them a word of God, but not to be as they are, but to be set apart, always ready to give an answer for the hope that's in us as God positions and moves, always caring about how and when he is going to deliver his people. And we always keep our eyes on that blessed hope that someday we will be harpazo, the church will be drawn to be with the groom. And I believe that day is coming soon. So we've got a lot to cover in Daniel. So many exciting things to talk about in the book of Daniel. I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you for listening to Engage in Truth. And you can learn more at calvaryfountain.com. This is a ministry of Calvary Fellowship Fountain Valley Church. Services are 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Sundays, and we'd love to see you there. God bless you, my friends. Take care.